So the smallest unit manipulated by the rules of syntax is not actually what we think of as a word. Instead, there are units smaller than words that play a role, and these units are called morphemes, and they are meaning-bearing units that may be what we think of as a word, but sometimes are smaller. So a nice example of this is the word goblin. So one goblin, two goblins, and the word goblins is actually made up of two morphemes. So there's the sort of goblin morpheme, which actually can stand on its own, and then there's that S, which corresponds to something like more than one or plural, right? And so that's why we talk about morphemes as being the units that get manipulated, because this is actually divisible into two meaning-bearing units. And first we're going to talk about some distinctions. So you can see bound versus free morphemes are discussed in this Ling space episode, but just to give you a quick recap here, a bound morpheme, as its name suggests, is a morpheme that is bound to something else. It can't stand on its own. It has to be attached to something. And so that plural S marker is a great example of this in English. So you can say, what's there? Oh, it's a goblin. Goblin can stand on its own. But if you want to indicate that there's more than one, how many are there? There are two. You can say two. Two can stand on its own. But you can't say, oh, there are Z for plural, right? You can't do that. So bound morphemes are like the plural marker S, sometimes pronounced as Z, as in goblins, and they can't stand on their own. And that actually, there's a little joke right here. So I must be your bound morpheme because without you I have no meaning. And that's not technically true because we can think about this as having that plural meaning, but in practice, right, we can't just say the Z on its own and have it mean plural, right? So that's the idea of a bound morpheme. Now, the other kind is a free morpheme. As I was mentioning, this is a morpheme that can stand on its own. It doesn't need to be attached. So goblin is an excellent example of this. Goblin stands on its own, 1 and 2. These are all free morphemes that stand on their own. They don't need to be attached to anything in order for them to have meaning in the sort of practical sense. Now, another distinction we're going to talk about is between derivational and inflectional. And derivational morphology is discussed in this Ling space video here. And the gist of it is that when you're adding this type of morphology, you're forming a new word, as we do with all morphology, but you're adding enough new meaning that you're potentially changing the word's category, that is, from noun to adjective or from verb to noun. So let me show you an example of this. So the word goblin is a noun and maybe refers to something like this little guy. And goblinish, if you add that ish, which is a bound morpheme, you usually see it standing on its own, it means similar to a goblin. So you're adding enough new meaning that this word goblinish is no longer a noun. It's actually a property. It's an adjective in this case. So a noun becoming an adjective through derivational morphology. And here's scowl. So scowl is maybe like something like making this expression here. And so someone who does that action, we usually indicate by the bound morpheme er in English. So a scowler is someone who scowls. So you're changing from a verb, the action, to a noun, someone doing that action through derivational morphology, right? You're changing the category because you're adding like enough new meaning to really change the meaning of it and get a new category of word. Now the other type is inflectional. So these in many languages will have less drastic but still important information. So because they're adding sort of less drastic information, they're not changing the word's category. Inflectional morphology will not change a noun to anything else or a verb to anything else. So a nice example of this is our plural morpheme from before, the Z, the goblins, right? That S pronounced as a Z. And so you have one goblin, you have two goblins, right? And so you've made this refer to the fact that there's more than one of these guys, but it's still a noun, and now it's still a noun. So that's inflectional. And with scowl, you have that same morpheme. We have overuse of morphemes in English that can actually indicate present tense when you have he, she, or it as the subject. So he scowls, right? It's happening now in the present. A little bit more of information about the event of scowling, but it's still a verb. And the same thing with scowling. Actually, that ing morpheme, which is also a bound morpheme, indicates that the action is continuing on. It hasn't completed, right? So scowling is talking about this continuing action of scowl, which is happening. And the ing is, scowling is still a verb. So from a verb to a verb, from a verb to a verb. This is inflectional morphology. You're not changing the category.